Section 2 is all about economic systems. And I know that's not the most exciting thing, but what you have to understand is that economic systems are the way that society organizes the production and the consumption of all goods and services. And so we're thinking big picture here with macroeconomics. So organizing the production and consumption of all goods. And so a few terms you'll see here, such as real GDP, business cycle, labor force, unemployment, fiscal policy, inflation, consumer price index. So a lot of big loaded terms here, so bear with me. And the first question I ask is recessions. You guys were very young when the last recession occurred. In 2007, the economy stood on the brink of collapse. And there's a really neat movie about the recession. It's an economic movie. It was very well done. I'll have to point you guys to it. We might watch some clips before too long. And it traces why that major recession occurred. But what I want to also help you understand is that recessions are part of a normal business cycle. Is that right now in Henderson County, we are experiencing a small recession. The summer boom is over, the tourists have gone back to wherever the warm places are, the big cities, and the leaves are off the trees, and we're about to start getting snow. So the tourist season is over in Henderson County, so we've gone into a bit of a recession. And you know what? It's perfectly normal. Business is down, there's fewer people in the restaurants and the stores, and it's perfectly normal. Why? Because that's how the business cycle of Henderson County works. And the businesses of Henderson County are very well prepared for that. They make most of their money during the summer season, and then they go into, let's say, a bit of housekeeping. You know, they'll focus on, yeah, they do with the leaf season too. And so those are normal business cycles. And so right now they're focused on administrative stuff, figuring out their budgets for the next year, and largely living off of what they made in the summer. And so what I also want to help you understand is that's a business cycle. We're in a recession right now in Henderson County, but it's perfectly normal because we're very well prepared for it. But recessions on the big scale are also a fairly normal part of the business cycle. When I was in high school in the 90s, we were experiencing one of the strongest economic booms in the past 100 years. It's hard to describe. You know, when I say $5 bought me a movie, you have to remember that was really only 20 years ago. And when I said that minimum wage got me a vehicle, you have to understand that was only 20 years ago.
That's a while.
That a minimum wage job got me a vehicle that I could call my own. And you also have to realize that I could have, in theory, paid my way through college. And that was only 20 years ago. It would have been more difficult at that time, but it was even easier when my dad was in college. Now, it wasn't realistic when his dad was in college. So there's about a generational period where the economy was much stronger than what it is now. And so part of that is due to the economic downturns that have occurred that are a part of a normal business cycle that had we been more prepared for, perhaps we could have planned for it. So a few terms that I need to help you understand. First is the real gross domestic product. This is the most accurate measure of a country's. So what is a real GDP? This is an economy's production after we figure out the distortions of price increases. You know, when I talk about the economy of my youth, I try not to use numbers. Because when I say that I bought a truck for $2,000, it doesn't translate. When I say that I afforded said truck off a job that paid $5.15 an hour that I was content with, it doesn't translate. Because again, when you think of the real GDP, I need to explain the buying power of said $5 an hour. I need to help you understand the actual worth of the truck that I only paid $2,000 for. Because in theory, you could afford a vehicle for $2,000 working a summer job now. But you're less likely to find a good vehicle for $2,000 right now, which is how the real GDP works. So economists measure periods of growth and decline. Okay, so back to a couple previous chapters. GDP is just the total value of all goods and services and the value of all the things made in this country in a year. It's a big, giant number. Again, it feels very esoteric. So here's where it gets even more confusing. The increase in price raises GDP. So if Apple makes the iPhone more expensive, that actually raises the GDP of our country. But it doesn't actually grow the economy. Apple charging more for the iPhone doesn't help you. Granted, we can write that on gains and losses as part of our growth in GDP. But the real GDP removes these distortions. It accounts for that. What you need to understand is the business cycle. These are alternating periods of growth and decline that the economy go through. And it's relatively normal. For example, during the dot-com era, when the internet was relatively new, I remember when Amazon started in the late 90s, Google started in the late 90s. All of these businesses were going online for the very first time. And that was part of why the 90s were such a strong period of economic growth. But it was immediately followed by the early 2000s. It was called the dot-com burst, where so many of those businesses started with really bad ideas, and they went bankrupt. So many of them went out. The early experiments with social media, many of them were failures. Many of the email platforms that started up in the 90s were failures. For example, my first email account was Hotmail. My first social media was MySpace.
MySpace is irrelevant.
The early version of Tinder was hotornot.com. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and so many of those businesses went under. And you've probably heard of some of those. There were far more. And so many of them failed. And guess what? That's a normal part of the business cycle. Because for every Bailey Foster that becomes the next famous knitter, there's far more that fail. There's far more that fail than there are that succeed. And so when we measure that on the big scale, again, that's just part of the normal business cycle. Okay, so do you agree that price increases can be a good way for businesses to succeed in times of economic decline? And this is another tricky question. If a business is losing money, what can they do? Well, they can raise prices in theory. But as we know, price is the biggest control in terms of demand, so they might also shoot themselves in the foot by doing that. And so GM, for example, is cutting costs by laying off workers. So the next part here, the economy goes through periods of growth and decline. Now, if the real GDP is up, that means expansion. That means the late 90s. When times are good, gas is cheap, life is simple. But if real GDP goes down, and here's the measure. If real GDP is in decline for 6 months or more in a row, that's called a recession. That's all it is real GDP is in decline for 6 months in a row or more. Most recessions only last about a year. During this time, many people lose jobs because the natural thing for a business to do is to cut cost when profits are down. And one of the simplest ways to cut cost is to reduce the labor force. So, in terms of education, schools were forced to do this by reducing staff through attrition. When a teacher would leave, they wouldn't replace that position. Teacher pay was also frozen during the recession. The idea there was that by not incentivizing labor will leave. We can reduce our workforce without having to fire people, because firing people actually costs money. And so when recessions occur, people lose jobs. Okay, so the civilian labor force. This is also a number that economists measure. This is all civilians, all non-military people who are of working age, who are either working or who are looking for work. So that's a number we measure, because it also helps us to come up with the unemployment rate. And the unemployment rate is the percentage of people in the civilian labor force. If you're not 16 yet, we're not measuring you as part of the civilian labor force, because even though in theory as a 15-year-old you could work, you're still not accounted in that. So the percentage of people in the labor force who are not working, but who are looking for jobs. So that's actually a very complicated number to arrive at. But the reason it's worth the effort is because we think about the impact of unemployment. So here's where, I got to make my plug. I want you to get good jobs. I want you to make lots of money. That's great for you, but that's also great for me. Well, yeah, in theory. And here's how I want to explain that. If we can drop the unemployment rate by just 1%, we get twice that back in economic growth. If we can drop the unemployment rate just by 1%, we get twice that back in economic growth. Because what are you going to do if you get a sweet job? Awesome, you're going to buy all the cool stuff. Well, great. The people who make all the cool stuff say thank you. And the people who work for the people who make all the cool stuff say thank you. And you're going to pay taxes on said cool stuff, both in income tax, state and federal, and in sales tax. And guess what? Yeah, my job's paid through that. And so economic growth is tied closely to employment. Now, changes in government spending or taxes. This is called fiscal policy. We've learned about this in several different places. How at the local level we have to figure out how we're going to make money and how we're going to spend money ultimately. And then on the national level, the federal government uses fiscal policy to figure out how much money to spend, how much money to collect in taxes. Of course, politics has a lot to do with this. That decision to cap the state income tax was a very political decision. And you were here when I asked the politicians why. And they gave their politically motivated views on why. Another term you need to understand is inflation. We talked about this a little bit already, but inflation is the sustained increase in the level of prices. And on one measure, it's a good thing. Movie prices are going up because people are able to pay more. That means, again, and they're selling for what they can. So movie prices are going up because people are able to pay more. People are able to pay more because they have more money. Now, how do we measure inflation? This is measured through the Consumer Price Index. This is the measure of change in price over time of specific group of goods and services. So if we're just looking at movie tickets and you wanted to know the Consumer Price Index, well, then you would need to go back in time and look at the price of the movie ticket from 1998 to 99 to 2000, 01, etc. every year, and you can chart that, and that gives you the Consumer Price Index. How has inflation affected movie ticket prices over the past 20 years? And you can get an accurate measure of CPI. And this is how you measure inflation. Now you would do that over multiple different variables. So you don't just want to look at movie tickets, because maybe that's just a fluke. Maybe movies have gotten more expensive because of the crazy huge budgets of awesome movies that we go see today. Relative to, say, if you watch Gone with the Wind, which was the blockbuster of the 1930s, their budget, even adjusted for inflation, is itty-bitty. And so there's a couple things about this. Number one, the more variables you start to plug into the equation, the better a picture you get about how inflation affects us. But it also can start to make you think, what if I can predict this? Economists are looking at trends, right? They're looking at not just movie tickets, but as many variables as they can. Big, giant spreadsheets. And so they begin to speculate, based on the trends, what are the prices of movie tickets going to be next year? Now, here's the thing. If you had some insider knowledge that movie tickets were going to double in the next year, that could lead you to invest in theaters, because suddenly they're about to make a lot more money. So if you begin to speculate, though, there's a downside to this. Because if everybody invests, it causes a bubble. And this is the exact problem that happened with the dot-com era. I mean, if you go back and look at old archived sites of hotornot.com, it was really dumb. It was a primitive version of Tinder, though. And it was an attempt, granted a primitive one, where Tinder was maybe more successful. But it caused speculation. People were like, whoa, the internet's the next big thing. People are going to meet exclusively online someday, and human interaction is going to diminish, and to a degree it has, but not to the degree that speculators predicted, and not as quickly as speculators predicted. While people rushed to invest because of speculation, it actually hurt the market. And it burst. And that was the cause of that particular recession. In 2007, it was over housing. And I'm not going to go into that for time's sake, but similar problem. Okay, so how can the government lower inflation? There's various ways, but in general, if you've got too much money in the economy, that's going to cause inflation. And so you can actually, the government does have a control over this. They can restrict inflation by reducing the money supply. And one of the simplest ways they do that is raising interest rates, which means people are going to borrow less money, which means there's going to be less money floating around the economy. Now, the stock market. Stock markets are also an indicator of economic health. Stocks are pieces of corporations. And when we're looking at stock growth or decline, what we're talking about is profits in the form of dividends and capital gains. So if you buy stock in Sony, and Sony comes out with a new PS5 and it's the game changer, it makes all other video games dumb, and people only buy PS5. Well, that was a solid investment. So you have stock in Sony. Yay, they've just crushed all the competition. They made just the next best thing. And so you're going to get dividends from that. Meaning, so you spend $100 in stock, they just grew by 10%, you're getting a check for $10 every single month. So you're getting a portion of that back. 10% on your investment return every month. Pretty good. Now, the stock value is determined by supply and demand. If they come out with a PS5 and it's a flop, well, that sucks. You actually lose money. Your $100 turns into 90 or 80 or etc. And on the big scale, that affect things. And just like the consumer price index, just like inflation, just like employment, these things can be tracked and they can be analyzed. And the more you know about them, the better off you're going to be. And so all of the stocks in this entire country are accounted for through different measures of the stock index. So there's the Dow Jones Industrial Average, there's the Standards and Poor's, these are two of the biggest measures. There's the NASDAQ, which we'll get to, which is the technology sector. So the Dow Jones Industrial Average looks at 30 key stocks, 30 different types of industries to try to get a representation of how the stock market is working. Standards and Poor's just looks at the Fortune 500. There's the New York Stock Exchange. That's where stocks are bought and sold. I'm sure you've seen that in movies or on television. There's also the NASDAQ, which is the electronic index. That is how technology is doing. Sony would be measured into the NASDAQ. Now, you can also watch the trends. And there's two terms that you need to understand here. A bull market means that investors are optimistic. This means it's a buyer's market. You're buying, you're buying, you're buying. And the prices of stocks are going up and up and up and up. And then there's also a bear market. This means that investors are pessimistic. And this could be cause of speculation. Maybe you read an article that the PS5 is going to be dumb. It's going to suck. It's going to be so lame. There's no Red Dead 3. Sorry. They're just not going to invest in it. Why? Because it's going to be lame. And as a result, investors are selling off their Sony stocks. Now, that's just one isolated instant. It'd be barely a blip on the NASDAQ radar. But if suddenly we learn, for whatever reason, did you guys ever hear about the Atari, what was it called? The video game collapse of the late 80s? You have heard about that? So, yeah, for whatever reason, so the original Atari was awesome. They tried to outdo themselves with the next model, and it was a colossal failure. I forget what it was called, but anyway, the first Atari was awesome. I actually had the first Atari. The second Atari sucked really hard. And because of that, because the industry was so new, people were giving up on video games. In fact, when Nintendo came out with the Nintendo Entertainment System, the big game changer in video games that got them back on the map, they had to market it as a toy, not as a video game system. And so they sold it with this robot. I can't remember the robot's name. But they actually put the picture of the robot on the box instead of the Nintendo, because the industry was in such disarray. The fact is that the video game market in the late 80s was a bear market. Investors were very pessimistic. I think the robot's name was Robbie, if I